Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
We want to talk today about an article that Cameron's been thinking on, and actually a whole constellation of thoughts that have to do with understanding history and politics in terms of tragedies and comedies. But we're using tragedy and comedy in kind of the classical literary sense. And so, Cameron, as we get started here, could you remind those of us who maybe aren't so sharp on all the things that we learned in high school English about what a comedy and a tragedy is? Could you refresh us what those phrases mean, and then give us an introduction in some of the ways that you're seeing those terms be used in our time, in ways in which we as Christians may want to have a definite perspective on how we want to be using them ourselves?
Oh, sure, certainly. But I think this was brought to my attention by an article. So I want to tell you how this came about, and then we'll define the terms. But November is approaching, and so people are already thinking a lot about politics. I think probably more worrying about politics, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But this came to mind with an article that I'll link in the show notes. It appeared in the magazine American Reformer, and it's by a professor at Beeson Divinity School, just up the street from me in Alabama. His name is Dr. Mark Devine. And so the title of the article is, "Why is Trump Still So Wildly Popular?" And now, cards on the table, neither Nathan nor I are Trump supporters. But I do think
the other
that
side
in
of things.
2024, people
we're just eye rollers in general.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, not the other side of things either. And I would say we're both classically conservative men as well. But I think now that it's 2024, the stakes are high. They're higher than they were last time as well. And this is definitely a situation. The political situation in this country is dire. I will freely admit that.
Here.
So people are revisiting this question. Here. So, but even people who previously were opposed to Trump, I think, are reconsidering now because of what's at stake. So, and I think it's fair we can mention some of these issues, Nathan, that are very, very important to us as Christians. Of course, the unborn, the sexualization of children, the attacks on marriage and the family. And these are not just, these are being very practically carried out and very methodically carried out. So these are massive items of concern. So all of this is brought to bear in this article. And part of why it caught my attention, Nathan, is because it's an eloquent defense of Trump, which you don't usually get. Let's just be honest. Usually the arguments that I hear are, we need a really tough outsider. We need a real tough SOB to go in there. You got to hold your nose and vote. But this guy is the outsider that we need to shake things up. But the category that Dr. Devine uses here is tragedy. And that's very intriguing to me. I'm a literature guy, so he had my attention right away. And he says in the article, "I take a tragic view of history." Now, again, I encourage our listeners, go read this article. Okay, I don't want to put any words in Dr. Devine's mouth here. I might give you a few choice quotes, but he's drawing his thinking from a historian, and I'll give you one quote here. Let's see. He says Trump's career arcs with a mythical figure like Ajax, and with that of actual generals like George Patton, Curtis LeMay, Douglas MacArthur, and William Tecumseh Sherman. This is still a quote, "These variously loathsome persons were first born with in the face of enemies deemed undefeatable without them, then wildly popular as they fought the enemy and won, and finally discarded as once urgently required and effectively deployed tools, but now no longer needed." I need to give you one more quote here just to get this to really, I think, to give an accurate picture of what he's saying. Quote, "The tragic view periodically assesses the character and greatness of threats to civilization such that extraordinary means are needed and sought in order to resist and quash them." So,
Hmm.
Nathan, you've probably noticed right away that's a fancy way of saying extreme times require extreme measures.
Desperate times, desperate measures.
Desperate times, yeah, right. That's it. Yeah, desperate times, desperate measures. Okay, all right. So let's look at some. So it occurred to me as I was reading this that I don't think that this is an accurate representation of how Christians look at history. This is absolutely true. This would be true, I think, if we were on our own. I want that to
Okay.
sink in for a second. Because I think a lot of us, when we are thinking about politics, even as Christians, do slide into a mentality where we assume, okay, but here, this is practical. We need hands-on solutions. And we're on our own. We need to do something here. And if we don't act, if we don't defend the defenseless, if we don't do something, we're facing very grave consequences. We have to do something. Political inaction is not an option. We got to do something. We're on our own. So I'm sympathetic to that, but we are not on our own. So tragedy if we look at the classical view of tragedy, and I'm talking about the tragedy analyzed by Aristotle in the Poetics, that involves the downfall. Classically, it involves the downfall of a person of great nobility. So the paradigm example for Aristotle is Oedipus Rex, i.e., Oedipus the king, right? Who's the oracle at Delphi prophesies that he will kill his father and marry his mother. Now, this is, by the way, Sophocles gives us the most famous rendition of this story, but it is a rendition. Sophocles did not make this story up. This was in circulation. He just gave us the most devastating version of it that's ever been recorded. And it's interesting. If you read Oedipus the King, you can break your brain trying to figure out any way that Oedipus could have gotten out of that situation. He hears that prophecy, and so he carefully orchestrates his life to avoid it. And in so doing, runs headlong, right? I mean, fulfills the prophecy to a T, does it all by trying to avoid it. So you have massive levels of irony in there, and it's just a very powerful. Wait, but tragedy also. So in this sense, yeah.
Quick question: can you do all tragedies rely so heavily on fatalism?
Well, that was actually the next word I was going to use. So you have a very fatalistic view here. So is Oedipus a terrible person? No, he's not. He's actually, tragedy relies on the downfall of characters of great nobility. Traditionally, not all tragedies do, but most, this one does. So no, is he guilty? He is absolutely guilty. He has in fact murdered his father, and he has married his mother. He has done everything. And he condemns himself most strongly by the end of the play. I mean, you have that unforgettable image that takes place off stage. This is Greek. These are Greek plays. So all of the shocking violence doesn't happen on stage, but he gouges his eyes out at the end of this play. But all that to say, does this actually match a Christian view of reality? So I think you hear this. I think most of us would recognize the stark beauty of this, although not everybody likes tragedy. Okay, it's true. I mean, one of the great questions in philosophical and literary circles is, why would anybody enjoy tragedy? Why does tragedy give pleasure? It's painful.
Okay,
but
hang on. Here's a hurdle for you to hop before you finish doing this. So you have, because you're saying, would any Christian say that the tragic view just is that a Christian perspective? You have, though, Frederick Buechner writing The Gospel as Tragedy as a book. So I think you want to. Yes. I think you want to say something here, because that would be, in my shallow understanding of all of this, at least one book that I've read that makes the case that the gospel is a tragedy. So differentiate for us here why separate that out.
That's important. Yes. And Buechner's favorite book, or play, I should say, that he returned to over and over again in his writings is King Lear. And King Lear is the bleakest of bleak. That's the darkest shade of tragedy you're going to get. Samuel Johnson famously really couldn't forgive Shakespeare for what happens to Cordelia. I mean, spoiler alert. It's been out for a long time, so I think you can handle that. So what I would say is this. Tragedy resonates deeply with us. So does it match a full Christian vision of reality? No, absolutely not. But does it match aspects of the human experience, life under the sun? I'm using the language of Ecclesiastes. Well, there we have to say yes. If we restrict our gaze to just this world and and what transpires and history, you will get a tragic view. I think that's going to be your takeaway. So if you concentrate only on human experience alone. Yeah.
All right. So for you fellow philosophical nerds out there in the Christian world, Cameron, would you say that the tragic view of history is true in an imminent frame? If we're using a little Charles Taylor lingo here.
Yes. Yes, because I mean,
if we are all that we've got,
only looking, if we're all that we've got, then this article, why is Trump still so wildly popular, is its argument is true. Or at least, I mean, if you're persuaded of the political vision of conservatism, you could now still make an argument that a figure like Trump represents the destruction of conservatism as it's classically been understood. But that's another argument. But so pushing that aside, then you would say, yeah, if this is your political vision, this article makes perfect sense. Because desperate times call for desperate measures. And I mean, notice also the article is elegantly written. And so you miss, I think, you can miss what is a fairly cynical argument in there. Because, you heard what he said about, the generals that he brings up who were once despised and then briefly used and then quickly discarded. This is his language.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty cynical description of, and a very instrumental use of people who represent some form of brute force. Now, that's so, but again, let's back up. Is that a true picture of the human situation? Now, tragedies will resonate with us because this side of eternity, we experience incredible suffering, unbelievable suffering. The question is, does that suffering have the last word? If it has the last word, the tragic vision's true. But if there's outside help, and if there's a greater arc of redemption, then that is not a true vision of reality, and you have more options available to you. Okay, so that's where comedy comes in. I'm going to pause there in case, Nathan, you have anything else you want to.
Okay, so
you want to run with there if you want to push back.
Yeah, no, let me just throw in a couple little seeds of thought here. So I'm thinking biblical characters that fit this paradigm or don't. So Cyrus is often a, kind of the trope pulled on by Christians as saying, here's somebody that God used for a time who wasn't even a believer. You also have a little bit of a Esther motif of for such a time as this, that, you're here just at this right place, the right time for this right thing. But then you get into a fascinating New Testament look at, I'm thinking of even, a Romans 13 of having a respect for the government, of praying for your leaders. When you're praying for the leaders of your nation, as the Bible tells you to do, you are there's a funny thing that's happening. When you're praying to God for the leaders of your nation, you have to be assuming that your leaders aren't the gods themselves. So there's almost a baked into that process recognition that there is a second layer to reality here that isn't solely defined within the political system. And so that's why it's a really healthy thing, not just to intercede on behalf of the leaders of our nation, but it's a really healthy thing for you to continuously remind yourself that your leaders aren't gods in and of themselves. So, even with the whole, the coin and whose image is on it, and it's been taught so frequently, like then the question of whose image is on you. Actually, when Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God's what is God's, I think it's a throat punch of saying, I don't believe Caesar is God. I think it's as simple as that. Of give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And he's differentiating those two out to say, I don't believe that Caesar is God. So before we make this turn to the I'm preemptively making an argument for the comedic vision of history here, because I think that's the biblical foundation, and certainly in the teaching of Jesus, to say, um, you are not on your own here. But this is true even from Isaiah all the way back, of like, the king determines this, the nations are but a drop in the bucket. The nations plot and plan, and the Lord laughs. I mean, this is pretty heavily laden biblical theme, that we come up with our best laid plans of mice and men, and says the Lord.
No, it starts from the beginning. It starts in the book of Genesis. You have a vision of a disruption into reality of this powerful God who upends people's lives and calls them to live in a manner that is countercultural. And you see this also, you see the massive tensions that erupt in the Old Testament really powerfully when Israel demands a king. We want a king. We want to be like the other nations. And then you see that whole historical drama unfolds on the basis of that. And the sad fact is, they have a king, but they want an earthly king. And so you see that tension entering in there very powerful. And of course, then that thus begins the,
So wait, do we choose tragedy?
Go through First and Second Kings and Chronicles.
Do we prefer tragedy?
Yes, because we prefer tragedy because we often default in a time of crisis to our own. We think we've got to turn to our own resources. We've got to do something. So the tragic vision very, very much concentrates on the here and now. What can we do? How can we fix this? Because as much as we talk about, you mentioned prayer earlier, Nathan, a convicting thought might be how, in all of your political activities right now, especially as we approach another election season, how much of those are devoted to prayer? And here's a follow-up. Do you see the thought of devoting significant time to prayer in those efforts as a waste of time, or as, oh gosh, that's a distraction? There are things I could be doing, though, actively campaigning and actually, trying to convince people to make the right vote and all of that. But I mean, the most important and powerful weapon at your disposal is prayer to the living God. Do we really believe that? As things get more difficult,
I'm going to say largely
we
no.
tend to default to largely no. I mean, we tend to we get pushed in the direction of a kind of a tragic view. And so let's look at comedy for just a second and just look at the contrast between these two. Yeah, turn the corner here. So if the tragic view involves fatalism and the downfall of a noble character, comedy looks so much different. Comedy, it doesn't have to be funny, by the way, in the classical sense. Now, comedy often is funny. Part of the reason comedy is often funny is because it involves not a noble character traditionally, not like an Oedipus Rex or a King Lear, but it involves an everyday person, somebody more normal, or somebody who's not the smartest, somebody who's a little bit more average. And it often, that's why it can be funny. It involves foibles, a lot of, so tragedies take place in palaces and in great cities. Comedies often take place in the bathroom and places like that, because they look at the funny side of human beings. They involve, the incongruity and clumsiness of our efforts. But the main feature of comedy, classically, is that they end well. They have a happy ending. And redemption is written into the framework of a comedy. So there's a redemptive story, and it usually involves the characters being saved in some unlikely fashion. So notice, for instance, that when we all kind of know this. If you are at all familiar with Dante, you know that the three, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso are called the Divine Comedy. And we know that comedy there doesn't mean exactly the same thing as an episode of The Simpsons. It's not predominantly a funny trilogy of poems. It has to do with the redemptive arc. So I would argue, as I was reading this article, my argument in short is that Christians have a comedic vision of history. We don't have a tragic vision. And because we We know that this ends well. We know. Now, if you're in doubt that this ends well, that's okay. Doubt is part of being a person, and we often walk on faltering feet and we stumble our way forward. But we need to all be reminded this election season that we serve the living God, that Christ has risen and he's coming back to judge the quick and the dead, and he's on his throne. But none of that is threatened by anything that happens. That doesn't mean we won't suffer. Suffering is part of human, is something that we always deal with anyway, and it's not permanent. So I've said enough to get me in a little bit of trouble here. So we can pause for a second.
Tell me, Cameron, I'm trying to think here. What is the role of hope in a tragedy? Or is there?
Oh boy. Yeah, that's a really important question. So, and I think that points to some inherent tensions in the word hope anyway. So can I give you two different kinds of hope, Nathan?
Sure.
And I think this might answer it. Okay. And I'm sure there are better, more, I'm sure there's a more rich way of drawing this distinction, but I think this is helpful so far as it goes. So there's what I call everyday hope, and then there is supernatural hope. Everyday hope. Here's the way I illustrate this, Nathan. Imagine there are two patients in a hospital, and they both have a terminal illness. It's a new condition, and they're under close observation. They don't have long to live. They're both going to die. The first patient says, well, this team of doctors are absolutely incredible. They're going to have a breakthrough. I just know it. They're going to find some way to stave this off and to stop this, and we're going to live. The second patient says, no, I'm sorry. We're not going to make it. But take heart. Because of their careful research, future patients may one day survive this illness. So this is a kind of a grim example. And by the way, I can make it worse. I think this is actually all of us in a sense, because we all have a terminal condition. We're all mortal. We're all dying. But the first patient is not hopeful. He's optimistic. Optimism just involves thinking things will turn out well, regardless of the circumstances, which, by the way, I think some people might be tempted to say that what I just said about comedy is a little bit optimistic and out of touch with reality. I'll get there in a second. But so that first patient's an optimist. The second patient is hopeful, because hope in its most basic sense just involves a sense of expectation that exceeds your present circumstances. It doesn't need to necessarily be anything great. It can be, well, maybe future patients will survive what I will succumb to here. Or it could be, here's a less grim example, Nathan, the teacher who, sees lots of kids come through their class day in, day out. Most of them are, and one of them who, for all intents and purposes, appears to be a lost cause, but then spots some potential in this kid. And on the basis of that potential, invests in them, pours into them, and thinks maybe one day this kid will turn their lives around. That's hope. And we need it. That's what gets us out of bed in the morning. That basic sense of expectation that exceeds present circumstances. So that's everyday hope. That's in tragedy. You have that. But the supernatural hope would be something that a hope and an expectation that exceeds your present condition and that offers some kind of a future redemption. So that would be, in Christian terms, the paradigm example is hope on the basis of Jesus's resurrection, that resurrection hope. And then Paul gets at that, of course, in 1 Corinthians 15, when he says, if Christ is not raised from the dead, we are of all people most to be pitied. That's part of what he's getting at there. So that's that. And of course, Peter calls it a living hope. That's a living hope. There's everyday hope, and living hope would probably be a better way to put it, right? So living hope is absolutely foreign to tragedy. There's no such thing as living hope. Yeah, in those. If you try to talk about that, you're out of touch with reality.
What? Yeah. So I like everyday hope, living hope, and then what about the category of promised hope? Because that seems to be a different. That's a Christian feature there that is a whole nother category.
Huge.
That that makes the livability of it
And it
possible, I
starts
think.
in Genesis again.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that idea of a living hope,
Right.
actually, my confidence in the living hope is because it's
Hmm.
promised by somebody who I think is capable of delivering on the promise. So that's in there. Help me. Um, so perhaps, you're talking
And it
about
comes in the face of very stark circumstances too. I mean, think about the first major promise to Abraham. I mean, think about all of the adversity he faces and the challenges to that. But not the least of which is this, the call for him to sacrifice his one, legitimate son, Isaac, after, on which hinges the whole, really the legitimacy of that promise in the first place. I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the
y-
stars. All of that called into question. I mean,
so in a
yeah,
tragedy, though, in a tragedy, he sacrifices Isaac.
absolutely. Yes. But see, there's a beautiful, so somebody, Christopher Hitchens brings that up in his debate with his brother, Peter Hitchens. And, he brings this up as an example of the barbarity of the Christian God. And Peter Hitchens gives the quickest, shortest response, which is so powerful. I think probably some people in the audience might have been tempted to think that was a weak argument. It wasn't. He said the whole point of that story is that the knife doesn't fall on Isaac, and that's true. I mean,
Mhm.
that's the marvel of that story. Because in any other, I mean, if you just delve into consistent literature and ancient literature in particular, and any other, I mean, the sacrifice, the needed sacrifice, I mean, it's inevitable. The knife will come down. The
Mhm.
fact the
Yeah.
knife
So
doesn't come down, and a sacrifice is provided, and of course, ultimately, the sacrifice, the ultimate, now we get to play youth minister, but the real sacrifice would come many years later on a Roman cross, but that's true. That's absolutely true. Youth pastor's right.
but here's the thing. So to defend a comedy against being optimistic is comedies do go dark. Um, in the sense that
Absolutely, they do. Yes.
you referred to the Divine Comedy. What's probably the most famous line of the Divine Comedy? Abandon all hope, ye who enter here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But you're
And of
saying that
course, it begins
so how does
with,
it end though? Okay, yeah. So complete the story then for us to show how
yep.
it's a journey into the darkness. But then what happens?
Well, I mean, that's why so many people point to Dante as a beautiful paradigm example of getting the balance of light and darkness, because he doesn't begin with the Paradiso. This is not Thomas Kincaid. He begins with, midway through life's journey, I'm butchering the lines here, I found myself in a dark wood. I mean, that line, when people read, that's the beginning of the Inferno. When people read that, you have to be a certain age to really appreciate that. I think as you've gained a little life experience, you've been hurt a little bit, you've seen things break. That starts to resonate deeply, because you're on much more intimate and less theoretical terms with the brokenness of the world and yourself. You see that. So Dante doesn't take you immediately to paradise. He leads you through hell, then to purgatory, where you might say loosely, I mean, this is, I don't want to run roughshod over this. I mean, Dante is of course devout Catholic and all that, but I mean, another way to look at that purgatory, journey is as of the road of sanctification too. I mean, as the moral reform that has to happen for you to become the kind of person who can handle heaven, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that works together beautifully and brings you this holistic vision of reality that does not exclude the darkness, but doesn't give it the last word. That's the key element here. And it does not admit that you are not on your own. Oedipus is alone. King Lear can weep tears of unremitting despair because it is all alone. There's no help available to him. That's not true of us.
Okay, let's take that to kind of turn in our final direction here, which is, I mean, on one hand, you can say it's really odd you guys are going on and on about stuff that's written hundreds, well, back to Aristotle, thousands of years ago. But we are, I hope, driving home the focus here that these paradigms of how you view reality, there's nothing new here, but one of these is true and one of them isn't. And as a Christian, it's the shift from tragedy to comedy that then gives us some creativity. Is creativity the right word?
Mm-hmm.
It gives us some moral guidance then on how we make decisions and what we put our hope in. So it's not like, oh, that's a nice story.
Well,
it's like, no, the way that this works out radically reframes your entire posture toward reality and other humans.
Well, it's true. It should be tremendously liberating and encouraging to you. It means the world is more capacious. It's roomier than you thought. You're not hemmed in on all sides. And also think about, this is how we make sense of the fact that Christ has chosen the weak things of this world. He's chosen the foolish things to shame the wise. I mean, this is all the stuff of comedy in the best
Jesus is born
sense.
in Nazareth.
Jesus is born in Nazareth in a the circumstances of his birth. Even well, of course, and look at the death of Christ on a Roman cross. I mean, you have that this darkest scene, and then wonder of all wonders, it's not the end of everything. The dereliction of the cross is not the end. It looks like it. It looks like everything has been undone. The worst has indeed happened. And then amazingly, Christ does not stay dead, but rises again. And so because of that, on the basis of his life, death, and resurrection, everything's upside down in the best possible way. And it doesn't. So you inhabit in a world that's way more capacious. And I know the stakes are high. I mean, Nathan and I know that. We have kids, for goodness sakes. We have young children. I mean, I can't tell you, Nathan, now I've lost count of the amount of times I get told, oh, I'm so glad I'm not raising children today. I'm so glad I'm not. I have a feeling people have been saying that for a long time, but people say that to me all the time. But because if life is indeed a comedy, you have the freedom and the liberty to say, whoa, what a time to be alive. Thank you, Lord, for giving us breath in our lungs for such a time as this. Yes, we face some very serious challenges. Yes, there is deep wickedness and perversion and evil in our culture. And yes, the West is in deep trouble. All of that is true. But we don't inhabit a tragedy. We're not on our own. And God is in control. And God can disrupt as he sees fit, and God can keep and God can refrain as he sees fit. But we know how this ends. And it ends well, regardless of who's in the Oval Office. So I think that's my takeaway. But also, I think that can be something. I mean, I say this as a gentle challenge to you. You don't have to resort to means justifying the ends logic on this. You would if we were on our own, but we're not on our own. So you have the room to not violate your conscience. You have the room to take into account your prophetic witness. You have the room. I'm just saying that the world is bigger than the argument of this article, I think, would lead us to believe.
Let me toss in one more irony here, or help me flesh this out. Is that, don't you? Because I could hear some people, like a cynical read on this, would say, okay, well, you're calling for a quietism, Cameron. Sit back, Jesus, take the wheel, or Cletus, take the reel, for you Tim Hawkins fans. There's, but so the oddity is that there's actually more freedom and more responsibility in the comedy than there is in the tragedy. So the role that you play in the outcome in a comedy is more significant than the role that you play in the tragedy, which is counterintuitive maybe initially, but if fatalism wins, then what you do doesn't matter. But Christianity isn't just a comedy; it's an interactive comedy. So we're not at all saying don't be involved, don't work your best, don't think your best, don't be, this is not a sit on your hands kind of podcast. It's just saying don't opposite. Worship in the wrong narrative arc of reality.
And also, don't fall prey to thinking that you vote a certain way and now all your responsibilities as a citizen are fulfilled. Yeah. I mean, that's in some ways that's the least that you do. I mean, well, not in some ways. That's really the least that if you look at the way it breaks down and your actual influence, that's probably, it's less than a drop in the bucket. The most important thing that you can do, and here, the most important thing you do is focus prayerfully and with all of, I mean, with, you work at this, loving the Lord your God with all that you are, and then your neighbor as yourself. To use political language, you want to practice self-governance. That's what's in short supply right now in the West. That's what's in short supply in our country. Nobody can control themselves anymore because we've all been taught that our emotions are our masters. And so we all follow our emotions and we're led by them willy-nilly into all sorts of places we don't want to go. And now right. The oracle has spoken. And now, of course, what do we have? I mean, for all of the sneering and laughing about, stupid traditional family values. Who are these idiots talking about manners and mannered society? But now we have buses with tinted windows. Now we have surveillance cameras everywhere. Now we have more and more and more and more government control because none of us can practice self-control. So the most powerful political action that you can take is working on self-control. It's got to start with you. And then it's got to start with you working positively in your little spheres of influence where you find yourself. And yes, vote, of course, vote responsibly, do all of that, but practice self-governance. The founding fathers, for goodness sakes, would have wanted you to do that. They would have said, yes, the cultivation of virtue is absolutely
would like
essential.
You to practice self-control as a part of the fruit of the Spirit.
And more importantly, the New Testament. Yes.
And
more importantly, the New Testament.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Anyway,
so I think virtue needs to be a key area of focus for all of us. For those of us who want to think practical, hands-on, we can push aside all of the literary genres and distinctions and just say we can work on self-discipline, work on virtue, because that's what's needed.
Yeah, and live within a paradigm of promised hope.
Live within a paradigm of promised hope. Absolutely, and I mean, again, that takes practice. That's why you go to church. That's why we sing great hymns. That's why we pray. That's why we gather together. That's why we read God's word and nourish our imaginations on the stories of God's promise that are true stories. And we look at the foibles and the weaknesses of our heroes of the faith and then rejoice that the Lord saves in spite of our weaknesses and works through our weaknesses. I mean, this is just all tremendously good news. I, for one, am so grateful that I don't have to be a Sherman or an Oedipus Rex, because guess what, Nathan? I'm not a guy of great nobility. I'm not somebody you want to send into the midst of a massive epic battle. I'm just little old me. And you know what? Because I can be little old me, and the Lord will use even little old me. That's the good news. That's the good comedic news of the gospel.
The Lord needs somebody who can quote Sophocles. Thanks, Cameron. Well, I hope that this whole conversation has been helpful to those of you who are listening, just as kind of a framing paradigm for how you want to think about not just history and the present, but also the future. I know it's been good and encouraging to me as well. Oftentimes we end our podcast by saying you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope. But this is really more of a timely recognition. And so I'm going to sign off by saying you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we talk about livable Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.